IFR training video, by
Toga thrust.
Holding exercises. Introduction. Holding representation on charts. Holding 5 points checklist. Holding visualization on PFD. Holding computation. Next step concept in holding. Wind corrections. Time check in outbound leg. 60 degrees before check-in inbound turn. Leaving the holding. Holding exercises.
Introduction.
We are facing major changes in aviation, mainly in instrument flying. With the growing importance of satellite positioning, old-fashioned navigation and approach techniques will soon become obsolete. What about pilot core competencies? Are we bound to follow the line and nothing more, or should we keep training those procedures and techniques to keep what makes a pilot, mastering? You think right if you are watching this video. Let's train as a pilot. Satellite navigation and approach techniques will be a part of your training.
Holding representation on charts. Holding VOR on radial 074, right turn. Holding NDB on radial 256, right turn. Holding NDB on radial 036, right turn, combined with a racetrack on same radial based on an inbound turn at 8,6 miles from the ILS DME. Racetrack NDB on radial 290, left turn. Holding VOR on radial 274, left turn. Holding waypoint on radial 139, left turn. Holding waypoint on radial 031, right turn, aligned with the final ILS. Holding at waypoints in an approach, with speed and altitude restrictions, MHA equals minimum holding altitude. Depiction of holding out of the route depiction to avoid overload of depicted informations. Holding 5 points checklist. Immediately upon reception of the holding clearance, and, if inbound to the holding fix, VOR, NDB, waypoint, cross radials, radial and DME. Proceed with the following checklist step by step. Reduce the speed to holding speed. Confirm frequency or waypoint and inbound to the fix. Confirm your bearing, RMI, is set on the holding facility, VOR, NDB, GPS. Set the CDI on the holding radial, holding inbound course. Compute holding entry by visualizing the holding on the PFD, if you have one, otherwise do it on your directional gyro. Finalize with type of entry, first heading, way of turn, right or left. The first heading, ideally, should be corrected with the interception after passing a beacon rule. Refer to the chapter on interceptions. Holding visualization on PFD. Visualization of the holding pattern on the PFD is the easiest way to solve the holding computation problem. If you don't have a PFD, you can use your directional gyro. Here is a PFD. We are on a heading of 360 degrees. Imagine we receive a clearance for holding on the radial 045 degrees with a right turn. Radial 045 degrees is here. We can mentally draw the holding pattern on the PFD, it's a right turn. If we consider the aircraft as coming from the bottom of the instrument to the center, we can immediately see that it will be an offset entry, offset radial 015, 30 degrees from the holding radial inside the holding pattern. You can also use the good old-fashioned way, holding right, offset right. So, the 70 degrees to the right of the arrival heading are dedicated to offset entry. The 110 degrees on the other side are for parallel entry. The rest is for direct entry. Here, the radial 045 degrees tells us that we have to perform an offset entry. We are still on a heading of 360 degrees. Imagine we receive a clearance for holding on the radial 045 degrees with a left turn, this time. So, same radial, same arrival heading, but reverse way of holding. We can mentally draw the holding pattern on the PFD, it's a left turn. We can immediately see that it will be a parallel entry, intercept and follow the holding radial. You can also use the good old-fashioned way, holding left, offset left. So, the 70 degrees to the left of the arrival heading are dedicated to offset entry. The 110 degrees on the other side are for parallel entry. The rest is for direct entry. Here, the radial 045 degrees tells us that we have to perform a parallel entry. Last of the three entries possible, we are still on a heading of 360 degrees. Imagine we receive a clearance for holding on the radial 150 degrees with a right turn. We can mentally draw the holding pattern on the PFD, it's a right turn. We can immediately see that it will be in direct entry. When we reach the fix, we turn right to the outbound heading. You can also use the good old-fashioned way, holding right, offset right. So, the 70 degrees to the right of the arrival heading are dedicated to offset entry. The 110 degrees on the other side are for parallel entry. The rest is for direct entry. Here, the radial 150 degrees tells us that we have to perform in direct entry. Holding computation. Holding computation consists of determining the type of entry. First heading. Way of turn. From the preceding chapter, we know how to determine the type of entry. For a parallel entry, we have to pick up a heading for a time outbound of 1 minute. Due to the silence cone, if we do that, we will fly parallel to the intended radial. We then have to compute an interception heading following the rule of the interception after overflying a beacon. Apply an attack corresponding to 1/3 of the angle of difference. From 360 degrees to 045 degrees equals 45 degrees, so 1/3 equals 15 degrees. Instead of turning to a heading of 045 degrees, continue the turn by 15 degrees and pick up a heading of 060 degrees to intercept the radial. The same apply to the offset entry to intercept and follow the offset radial. Remember that. For a parallel entry, the two first turns are opposite of the holding. Holding right, two first turns are left, the rest is right. So for a holding to the left, first turn to the right, then turn right directly inbound to the station, easiest way. Then, when overflying the station, turn left into the station, turn left into the holding pattern. Remember that. For a offset entry, all the turns are the same way as the holding pattern. So for a holding pattern right turn right to intercept and follow the offset radial for 1 minute, then turn right to intercept the holding radial inbound. Remember that. For a direct entry, all the turns are the same way as the holding pattern. You simply, after passing the silence cone, turn to the outbound leg of the holding pattern. To compute the parallel entry we have seen earlier, the result should be. This will be a parallel entry, first heading 060 degrees, right turn. To compute the offset we have seen, the result should be. This will be an heading 020 degrees, 015 degrees plus 1/3 of the angle of difference, right turn. To compute the direct entry, the result should be. This will be a direct entry, first heading 225 degrees, right turn. To be complete, note that, in reality, we are talking about tracks and not headings, as we have to correct all those for the crosswind we will have. Next step concept in holding. Next step concept. To make sure everything is done in due time, we apply the next step concept each time the aircraft enters or stops a turn. The next step concept is as follows. Turn to the new heading, switch the heading bug first and anticipate the wind correction. Time. Start, stop, reset the chrono. Twist, something else than the heading bug to twist, GPS, VORs, COM, bearings, CDI, bugs, minimas? Do we have to contact, answer, report to the ATC? Throttle. Is the speed corresponding to the power set? Are the engine instruments in the green? Is the fuel balanced? Are we making any ice? Do we have to climb? To descent? Next step will be, state the next step coming in the procedure, start timer beam, turn right, turn left, climb, descend. Wind corrections. Wind corrections. Of course, in real life, wind is always present and makes life a little bit harder. Two things you have to consider: longitudinal wind and crosswind. When established on outbound leg, altitude. Longitudinal wind, you have to correct because the goal is to complete the pattern outbound plus turn inbound plus inbound leg in 3 minutes or as close as possible. If you are flying an aircraft for which the speed is 120 knots, the airspeed number, ASN, is 2, 120 equals 2 times 60. The rule is, if you have longitudinal wind, take the wind force divided by the ASN, here 2, and modify your outbound time. For example, having 18 knots headwind, you have to increase your outbound time by 9 seconds, 18 halves. If you have a tailwind, you have to reduce your outbound time. For the crosswind, still with an ASN of 2, you have to double the drift correction, to cope with the drift during the outbound turn and the drift during the outbound leg. The drift correction in this case should be half of the crosswind because we have an ASN of 2. That's the correction we would take for radial tracking, for example, but we have to double that correction, so half of the crosswind times 2 equals value of the crosswind. So if we have, let's say, 20 knots crosswind from the right, we should take 20 degrees correction to the right. 2/3 time check in outbound leg. There are 2 position checks to be performed while flying in holding pattern. The 2/3 time check while flying the outbound leg. The 60 degrees before check in the turn towards the inbound leg. 2/3 time check outbound, relative to the teardrop radial and see if you are at the correct position, too much inside or too much outside. At 2/3 of the outbound time, you should be 10 degrees offset of the teardrop radial, which means that the tail of the RMI needle should indicate the holding radial plus or minus 40 degrees, depending if the holding is to the right, or minus 40 degrees, depending if the holding is to the right or to the left. Let's assume you are flying a standard holding pattern on the radial 090 degrees, the teardrop radial is 060 degrees. At 2/3 of the outbound time, you should cross the radial 10 degrees before, i.e. here the radial 050 degrees. If the RMI tail shows 050 degrees, then you are well positioned. If the RMI shows, for example, 045 degrees, you are too much outside of the holding pattern, you should turn right. If the RMI shows, for example, 055 degrees, you are too much inside and you should turn to the left. Remember that, if the outbound timing is 1 minute, you have only 20 seconds to react. 60 degrees before check-in inbound turn. 60 degrees before check. To avoid overshooting the inbound radial, 60 degrees before reaching your heading inbound, here 270 degrees, so 60 degrees before it shows 210 degrees, the needle of the CDI, for VOR or RNP holding, should be alive, meaning that you are within the 10 degrees of your target radial. If the needle is not yet alive, it means that you will undershoot your radial, so stop on that heading and wait for the radial to become alive. If the radial is alive before that 60 degrees checkpoint, it means that you may overshoot the radial, modulate the bank angle to maximum 30 degrees to avoid overshooting the radial. Leaving the holding. Leaving the holding. If you entered the holding because you needed time to prepare, you are not ready for the approach, then state to ATC that you are now ready and wait for a clearance to leave the holding. You must receive a clearance from the ATC to leave the holding or to change your altitude. If you entered the holding on ATC request, you asked for an ETA, estimated time of approach, that approaching that time, call the ATC and request further instruction. If you entered the holding because it is stated in the procedure, then follow carefully the procedure published. Holding exercises. We will perform holding exercises as follows. 1 holding VOR parallel entry. 1 holding VOR offset entry. 1 holding NDB parallel entry. PS offset entry. 1 holding GPS direct special entry. All those exercises will be explained in flight, focusing on the PFD, with the holding chart on the side.
VOR holding, parallel entry. Aircraft approaching the VOR from the northwest, heading 120 degrees. We are approaching the beacon on a heading of 122 degrees. We are 5 miles to the beacon. VOR holding, offset entry, aircraft approaching from the south, heading north. NDB holding, parallel entry, approaching the beacon from the west, heading 100 degrees. GPS holding, offset entry. Approaching the beacon from the northeast heading 240 degrees. GPS holding, direct special entry. Approaching the beacon from the northwest heading 120 degrees.